Hello and welcome to this GCSE History exam paper guide. In this video we'll be looking at the structure of paper 1. That's your British sector and medicine paper. We'll be following the exam layout and timings introduced in summer 2025. This video will give you an overview of how to tackle the paper. Alongside that, do remember that you can find other videos on our channel which go through the technique for the individual questions in more detail. First up, here you can see an overview of how the paper will be laid out. Now, before you sit the exam, you should memorise how long to spend on each question. You should also do some timed practice of your own on the different question types. So the paper starts with two key features questions, 1A and 1B. These will be about the British sector of the Western Front. Do them both in the same way. Firstly, underline the focus of the question. In this case, it's the problem of trench fever. Then write no more than 2 sentences. The first sentence gives a relevant feature. The second sentence gives a little more specific detail about it. Take care to make sure that your feature and detail match. Here's an example. My key feature is that trench fever was caused by body lice. And I add a little extra detail about how those lice spread. This is the correct technique. Now look at this one. My key feature is about the treatment of trench fever, but my extra detail is about something different, prevention. So the key feature and the detail do not match. So my technique is not right here. The next question is a source evaluation question about the British sector of the Western Front. Start by underlining the focus of the question. In this case, it's about the problem of trench foot. Prepare both sources by underlining relevant content. If you have a picture source, you should circle key details. Then do the same for the provenance. Underline key features like who made the source, when, where, and why. Then write 1 paragraph about each source. Do not try to combine or compare them. There's no need to do this and you won't get any extra marks. Now, you will never be given a source which is useless. So always start with the positives about the sources. Follow this structure when you write. Start with the content. Take a quote from the source, make an inference of your own, and then support it with your own detailed knowledge. Do this twice if you can. Use this little phrase to get your technique right. The source says, which suggests that this is accurate as we know. When you're done on the content, then write about the provenance of the source. Explain a positive feature of the provenance and then a limiting feature. And finish your paragraph with a judgment. How useful is the source? And summarise your main reasons why. Now, before we move on to the next question, let's just remind ourselves of some of the things we might think about when we're evaluating sources. Firstly, here are the most common types of sources which we might be given on the exam paper, together with some of the positives and limitations to get you thinking. Now, it's very useful to know about these types of sources, as this will give you an idea of the sorts of points you could make when writing in the exam. Whatever source we're given to evaluate, we're going to think about the following. When we're looking at the content, we might ask ourselves, is the content relevant? Now, in other words, does the information in the source match the inquiry we're following? If it does, you could explain how the information in the source helps to answer the inquiry. We might also ask, is the content accurate? Now, the best way to do this is to support or to challenge the content in the source with some of your own detailed knowledge. When it comes to the provenance, we might look at the nature, the type of source, the origin, who made it, when and where, and we might look at the purpose of the source. Why was it made? And using these things, we could then ask ourselves, is the creator of the source an expert, providing us with expert testimony? We might think about, who was the source aimed at? Was it aimed at a public audience? And does that perhaps affect what the creator has said? Or is it only designed for a personal audience? Now, often personal accounts tend to be particularly honest reflections because they're written only for one person rather than for an audience. Now, you could also consider whether or not the source is reliable or trustworthy. Perhaps the content has been censored or staged for a particular reason, but you'll have to explain why you think this. The other thing we could think about with provenance is typicality. Now, this means, does the source show how things were everywhere at all times? Or perhaps the source only really shows how things were, for example, in the first year of the war, or perhaps how things were at the Battle of the Somme rather than everywhere on the front. Now, although you're not going to comment on all of these aspects, you are going to try and comment on some of them in your answer. When you're doing this, you might refer to how accurate, how reliable, how relevant, or how typical the source is. And you can see that I've given you some sentence starters which you could use in your work here. The next question is the historical inquiry question. The first thing we need to do is underline the focus of the question. Now, this will be exactly the same as the focus in the previous question. So in this case, once again, we're working on the problem of trench foot. Now, the examiner will give you a framework with 4 steps to complete. Before you start to complete any of them, you should think about all 4 steps. Now, this is really important because the steps work like a chain. So you should work out exactly where your answer is going to go before you start to write. Let's look at how to do each of the 4 steps. In the first step, you should pick out one short relevant quote from the source. Now, this has to be relevant to the inquiry, which in this case is the problem of trench foot. You then need to think of a question of your own to follow up that quote. Make sure that your question is relevant both to the quote that you chose and to the focus of the question, in this case, the problem of trench foot. In the next step, you need to come up with a specific type of primary source from the period, which you would use to answer your question. Now, by primary source, we mean a source created by people during the time period itself. So we don't want a television documentary or a web page. We don't want a historian's work because these sources were created later after the events. We want primary sources from the time period. For example, we might want the diary of a stretcher bearer, somebody who was actually there and created the source at the time. Remember the list of sources which I showed you earlier in this video, as these will help you. In the final step, you should explain how that source will help you to answer your question. Try to explain what information would you hope to get from the source, and how would that help you to answer your question. Now, another piece of advice here is that when you decide what type of source you would like, try to be super specific. For example, Diary of a Nurse is just not specific enough. We need to know exactly what kind of nurse, and perhaps where or what point in the war we want this diary to come from. So how would this look? Let's see a model answer. Firstly, I start with a relevant quote from the source, which is all about the number of trench foot casualties. My question is about whether this was typical. Were there always so many trench foot cases? Note how I'm starting my question here with the phrase, was it always the case that? Now that's a really good phrase to use here if it fits with your source. Next, I describe a specific source to use. Notice how specific I'm being about my source here. I want medical records showing the number of trench foot cases from different parts of the front in different years of the war. Finally, I explain how that source will help me to answer my question. I'm hoping to get some statistics on trench foot cases, which will allow me to see if the number of cases dropped in the later part of the war. Now, the next part of the exam is all about medicine in Britain since 1250. We start with question 3, a similarity or difference question. We're given a lot of space to write in. We won't need to use all of that. The first thing we need to do is to read the question carefully, and we underline the concept, either similarity or difference, the focus, that means the topic, and the two time periods we're being asked to compare. Now in this case, the concept is similarity. The focus of the question is preventing the spread of infectious disease. Our first time period is 1500 to 1700, so the Renaissance, and our second time period is 1700 to 1900. We then write 3 sentences for our answer. The first sentence will be like a big point, in which we identify a big difference between the two time periods. The second sentence will be a specific example from our first time period, and we repeat that in the third sentence by giving a specific example from the other time period. Because we're comparing time periods, we'll use a comparing phrase like whereas or similarly. Here's an example. In both time periods, they used preventions based on miasma. In the Renaissance, they used posies and pomanders during the Great Plague. That's my specific example. And likewise, Nightingale also tried to drive bad air away by improving ventilation. So that's my example from the second time period. Now, just for a moment, Imagine we were asked to write about a difference between these two periods instead of a similarity. We could very easily use exactly the same content and just tweak our answer slightly to make it focus on difference. Here's how it would look. Note the phrases in bold. Those are the only bits that I needed to change to make it focus on difference rather than similarity. Next, we have an explain question. Now, the technique here is exactly the same as the explain questions on paper 2 and paper 3. The first thing we need to do is read the question really carefully, and we need to find the focus. That means what we're being asked to explain, and the time frame. In this case, we're being asked to explain why attitudes towards surgery changed. And in this case, our time frame is 1800 to the present. Now, the structure of our answer is going to be very straightforward. We're going to write 3 PEE style paragraphs. Each paragraph will focus on a different reason why attitudes to surgery changed. Now, it would be a good idea to spend a moment thinking about what your 3 reasons are going to be and jot them down. The examiner will give you 2 suggested ideas for things you can write about. These are optional. You don't have to use them. If you want to get to the top level, you must also have a point of your own. Here are the 3 reasons I'm going to write about. My first paragraph is going to explain that anaesthetics made attitudes to surgery more positive because it was less painful. In my second paragraph, I'm going to explain that antiseptics made people more positive about surgery because there was less risk of infection. My third paragraph is going to explain that high-tech surgery made people view surgery more positively as it was more accurate with less scarring and a shorter recovery time. When we write our paragraphs, here's how we'll structure them. In our big point, we'll give a reason addressing the question directly. Then, in our evidence and explanation, we will explain that reason using some specific detail of our own. Now, we're going to try and write developed explanations. That means we're going to need to use our explaining connectives, and you can see I've given you some here to remind you. The best explanations have a chain of these explaining connectives, one after another, really developing an explanation in detail. The other thing to note here is that we don't need an introduction or a conclusion for this style of question. My final tip is that there is no need to give a balanced answer. For example, we don't need to write for and against, because we're not being asked to debate the pros and cons of something. We just have to explain why something happened. Next up, it's the judgment question. Now, we're actually given a choice of 2, and we can pick the one that we prefer. Whichever one we choose, here's how to approach it. First, read the question. Find the statement of opinion. That's easy to spot because it's in inverted commas, a bit like a quote. And we underline the time frame and what it is that we're being asked to judge. Now, in this case, the time frame is 1250 to 1500, so the medieval period. And I'm being asked to judge if the physician was the most important person giving care and treatment. Take time to read that statement of opinion very carefully, and make sure that you have understood what it is that you're being asked to make a judgment on. Now you know that you have to write about how far you agree with that statement. So this is going to lead you to a balanced answer. You should plan your answer by writing down 3 relevant topics and then ranking them in order of how far do they support the statement. Once again, the examiner will give you some ideas or suggestions, but you don't have to use those. If you do use them, you need to have another point of your own to get to the top level. Here's my plan for this question. I'm going to write about 3 topics: physicians, women, and apothecaries. My paragraph on physicians will most support the statement of opinion, because I'm going to explain how physicians were the most qualified people giving care. So I've ranked that number 1. My paragraph on women will least support the statement of opinion, because I'm going to explain that women treated far more people than physicians, so they're much more important healers. So I've ranked that number 3. My paragraph on apothecaries will support the statement a bit and challenge it a bit, because I'm going to explain that apothecaries gave more practical remedies than physicians, but they often prescribed what physicians recommended, so I've ranked this 2nd. Overall, I'm mostly going to disagree with the statement of opinion. Now you will need an intro for this question. In your intro, you should address the question, you should tell the reader what your 3 topics are going to be, and you should make an overall decision. How far do you agree with the statement? You could give your main reason why. Then you write 3 main paragraphs. You should follow PEE structure here. Start with the big point that addresses the question. You could use my suggested phrase here. Then give your evidence and explain either how it supports the statement or how it challenges the statement, or you could explain both sides, getting a bit of debate in your paragraph between for and against. At the end of your paragraph, say what your decision is in this area. Now repeat this structure for each of your 3 main paragraphs. At the end of your answer, you will also need a quick conclusion. Here, state your overall decision. Give the strongest counterpoint against your decision, and then give your winning point. One tip here is to make sure that you are clear about the criteria you are using to judge. For example, often when we're writing about medicine, we use criteria like how many people were affected, how many lives were saved, how long did the idea or treatment last for. In this question about healers, I'm going to base my decision on how many people they treated and how qualified they were. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, don't forget to give it a like, subscribe to our channel, and take a look at the other GCSE history videos on our YouTube channel.